was the owner of 2 hair salons in LA. This case is a pretty short one because even though the articles I read were like, oh, it was sensational in LA, like the story rocked the newspapers, like there really isn't all that much on it. So unfortunately, yeah, it's going to be a bit shorter than my usual case, but I think it's still very interesting. So also today is my birthday. Leave a comment guessing how old you think I am. The actual day that I'm filming this on, or night I guess, is my birthday, but probably it'll be uploaded after that, so yeah. I got this for my birthday. Focus. Yeah, there we go. It's a black opal bracelet from my boy Brian. So, before I get started, if you like my videos and you like my channel and you want my channel to grow and other people to find my videos, then leave me a like and a comment and subscribe if you're not subscribed already. So yeah, alright. On Halloween 1957, as Peter Fabiano and her husband Peter were about to go to sleep, the doorbell of their home in Sun Valley, California, just outside Los Angeles, rang. Despite it being past 11 p.m., they figured it was just an older trick-or-treater, and Peter got up and walked downstairs to answer the door with the candy bowl. Quote, "Isn't it kind of late for this sort of thing?" Betty heard Peter ask. She couldn't hear the response, just a muffled voice that sounded like a man impersonating a woman. Then there was a pop, a thump, and finally a screeching sound like a car speeding off. Betty ran downstairs and found Peter sprawled on the floor, unconscious and bleeding from his chest. Betty's 15-year-old daughter from another marriage, Judy Solomon, had also come down in response to the noise, and she ran next door to their police officer neighbor for help. When he got to their house, he called it in, and Peter was rushed to Sun Valley Hospital, where he was pronounced dead at the age of 35 from a .38 caliber bullet lodged beneath his heart. Peter and Betty met in the 1940s. In the late 1940s, Peter was an ex-Marine who'd served in World War II, and Betty was a divorcee from her first husband with 2 children, a son and a daughter. They got married in Kingston, New York, where Peter worked as a truck driver. In 1956, just a year before his murder, Peter and Betty moved to LA and opened 2 beauty shops, which were doing very well at the time. After the shooting, Betty remained sedated for a few days, which I don't know if that was like she was in the hospital and they were just giving her like Xanax or something, or what, but I guess it was the 1950s, so women were always drugged back then. Anyway, she made herself available to the police for questioning after a few days. In her account of Halloween night, she told the police that she thought there were 2 people at the door, 2 men, with one pretending to be a woman. The only other witness to the shooting was a teenager who had seen a car speeding away from the neighborhood. There was no other evidence since the killer hadn't left any bullet casings behind, and the police's search for fingerprints on the doorbell came back with nothing. Despite Peter and Betty being pretty well off from their 2 beauty shops, nothing had been taken from the home, so it wasn't a robbery gone wrong. Newspapers called it the trick-or-treat murder, and when one paper pointed out that the shooting was reminiscent of a gang hit, the police ran with that and dug into Peter's background, but all they found was a misdemeanor charge from 1948 for bookmaking, which is like illegal betting, you know. Since the 1948 charge Goldine was born in Rockford, Illinois, the daughter of German immigrants. By 1940, she'd moved to LA to work as a secretary, and on October 29, 1944, she married a Naval Hospital pharmacist named Herbert Crow. They got divorced not too long after, though, and apparently Goldine was actually lesbian, but she'd spent her life suppressing her feelings, and so that's why she got married to a man. When Joan and Goldine met about 3 years before Peter's murder, Goldine was a medical secretary, or another article I read had her listed as a lab technician, so I'm not really sure which she was, but at LA Children's Hospital, they became friends pretty fast and spent a lot of time together, drinking coffee and gossiping. One of Joan's favorite topics was Peter Fabiano, her evil former employer. Joan was heartbroken and angry that Betty had gone back to her husband. Joan called Peter, quote, evil and vile, a man who was destroying everything around him. She told Goldine that Peter, quote, mistreated his wife, and that he was dealing in narcotics, that Peter was, quote, always bothering Betty at home, and that he was cruel to Betty and her children. After a while, Peter was all they talked about, and after about 2 months of that, Goldine hated Peter too, even though she'd never even met him. They both thought that Peter was a monster who had to be destroyed. On November 16th, the police arrested Joan, and she insisted that she had nothing to do with the murder, pointing out that she was home the night of the murder, her alibi being that her car had been parked outside of her door the whole night. The police questioned her acquaintances. One named Margaret Barrett told them that Joan had borrowed her car Halloween night and driven it about 37 miles total before returning it the next morning. The police confronted her with that fact, and Joan said she had taken a short drive to pick up groceries, and she repeated over and over that she hadn't pulled the trigger that night. Since the police didn't have any real evidence of her guilt to go on, they had to release her. A month later, the police received an anonymous tip that led them to a rented locker in the LA branch of Bullock's department store. Inside they found a .38 caliber pistol, which ballistics confirmed was the murder weapon, and a scan of gun store sales in the area pointed them to Goldine. When the police arrested Goldine at her house in Hollywood, she easily broke down and admitted everything, telling them that she had pulled the trigger because Joan had cast a spell on her, that she had been powerless against Joan's charms. After confessing, she told the police, quote, it's a relief to get it off my mind. Police hauled Joan back in response to that, but unlike Goldine, she kept quiet and stone-faced the entire time and didn't give them any details. Quote, Joan and I discussed killing Fabiano many times, Pizer said in her confession. We were undecided whether we should use a poison, a gun, or a knife. They finally settled on a gun, and with money that Joan gave her, Goldine bought the .38 revolver in Pasadena, telling the dealer that she needed it for home protection. She bought only 2 bullets. Joan decided that Halloween night, a time when a person running around the streets in a disguise would not raise an eyebrow, would be the perfect time to carry out the killing. In the meantime, Joan brought Goldine by the beauty shop a few times in October, so she would know what Peter looked like. On Halloween night, Joan showed up at Goldine's house in the car she'd borrowed from her friend, and drove to the Fabiano's house, arriving at 9 p.m. Joan had gotten together a costume for Goldine to wear, which consisted of a pair of jeans, a khaki jacket, a hat, red gloves, and a domino mask, like Robin's in Batman, and black face paint to hide her face. The gun would be hidden in a paper bag. They waited in the car until the lights went out in Betty and Peter's bedroom, at which point Joan told Goldine, quote, all right, go do it. Goldine put on the mask, walked to the front door, and rang the doorbell twice. When Peter opened the door, Goldine was trembling so hard that she could barely hold the gun, telling police, quote, I had to use the left hand to hold the right hand in order to pull the trigger. Despite that, she raised the gun inside the bag and hit him dead on. Then she rushed back to the car, where Joan kissed her and said, thank you. They fled the scene and dropped the car back off at Barrett's house in Hollywood, leaving the khaki jacket inside. Quote, forget you ever knew me, was the last thing Joan said to Goldine as they went their separate ways on foot. Goldine cut up and burned the rest of the outfit she'd been wearing the following night. The day after the murder, she realized she still had the gun, so she rented the locker at the department store, where she dumped the revolver and forgot about it. blooming of 1957. In the meantime, a judge ordered 3 different psychiatrists to examine the women, since the court thought that homosexuality might have made them unfit to stand trial. That's kind of crazy. Joan was quoted as saying, "I had no motive personally. Whatever motive I had was to please Joan. I was easily influenced. I have been impressionable and always trusting." They were both charged with first-degree murder originally, and Joan pled not guilty, while Goldine pled not guilty by reason of insanity. On March 11th, 1958, just before their trials were set to start, they cut a plea deal for second-degree murder, which sparked a public outcry, with newspapers viewing the deal as being too soft on killers just because they were women. The real reason that the plea deal was offered was apparently because Goldine was so pathetic that it seemed unlikely a jury would send her to the gas chamber, even though she had confessed to killing a stranger in cold blood. And if one killer skirted justice, it would be impossible to get the accomplice and mastermind convicted. That tracks, honestly. Goldine wept as she recounted the night of the shooting in front of the jury during her trial. Reports say Joan smiled as she was led out of the court that day. The judge sentenced both of them to 5 years to life in prison. That's such a weird sentence to me. Like, there's a huge difference between 5 years and life. Like, damn. Goldine was eventually released. I couldn't figure out how much later she was released, like how much time she actually ended up serving. But she remained in the Los Angeles area. In 1971, she was made an officer of the Miracle Mile chapter of the Professional Women's Club. And that's all the information about her, really, that exists, other than the fact that she died at age 83 in 1998. Joan was presumably released at some point, though there isn't much trace of her after 1957. Betty went on to live a full life. She sold the beauty business and died in 1999 in Palm Desert, California. It's unknown if she had a hand in her husband's murder or not. So yeah, that's the whole case. It's pretty short, honestly. It's pretty sad what happened with Goldine, I guess, because she, probably would never have murdered someone if it wasn't for Joan. But yeah, I guess like she said, she was impressionable and trusting. Though, I don't really know how that translates to being a murderer, because like, even if you're impressionable and trusting, like, everyone knows that murder is wrong, right? So, I guess this was a classic case of like, if I can't have her, then, I was gonna say that no one can, but Betty wasn't the one who got murdered, so, it's like, if I can't have her, then you can't either, Peter. Kind of a case, I guess. Yeah, though it didn't seem like they really put all that much thought into, like, getting away with it. Like, sure, Goldine dressed up in a disguise and whatnot, but, like, it didn't seem like Joan was really all that interested in, like, what happened to the gun after the shooting, or, like, really covering her tracks. Because she got found out pretty fast. But yeah, that's just my opinion about the case. Leave me a comment down below telling me what you thought. And yeah. I know I said it in my last 2 videos, but my next video really will be another Japanese true crime case. Because Halloween's almost here, so there isn't really enough time for me to do another Halloween related case, or another, like, I was thinking about doing like a R No Sleep video, or like a other Reddit stories one, like Halloween themed. Am I the asshole? But yeah, I didn't end up having enough time, so I'm sure I'll find other Reddit stories to post though. But yeah, like I said before, leave me a like and a comment, and subscribe to my channel if you watched it all the way and you're not subscribed yet. And yeah, look forward to my next video. Have a good night, and I hope I'll see you next time.